I'm happy to be here to talk to you all about stress, which I'm sure you're very familiar with. School is stressful. Growing up is stressful. And in fact, after you've grown up, you still will face stress. As an example, here I am trying to talk to 1,000 people. That can be stressful. And so it's important for you and me and everybody else to understand what stress is and what it does to the body and to the brain, and most importantly, how to cope. And in this presentation, I will suggest at least 10 different things you can do to cope with the stress that you face either as you grow up or after you have grown up. Now, one definition of stress is that it's something in the environment or something you think about that makes you feel upset or feel bad. It may cause you to worry or be anxious. And in many cases, you feel overwhelmed and defeated by the stress in your life. And it certainly impairs learning and school performance. And it can even make you sick. And I'll explain some of the physiology of that in a few minutes. I suppose the first thing we ought to know about the biology of stress is that it is mediated through a portion of the brain called the hypothalamus. Hypo means below, so the name suggests that this is an area of brain below the thalamus, in which you can see in this midline picture. And the hypothalamus is shown in green. And it's shown as little clusters, different clusters of nerve cells in the hypothalamus, and they supply input to the pituitary gland where stress hormones are released. Now, in the lower picture, you'll see that there are neurons displayed here in purple and blue, and some are yellow and one is green. These neurons send their terminals down into the pituitary gland, which is shown on the bottom. And some of these neurons go to the posterior pituitary, where they release certain chemicals that get picked up by the veins, shown in blue here at the bottom. And those hormones are chemicals like that don't involve stress. Vasopressin and oxytocin are released directly in the posterior pituitary. But in the anterior pituitary, there are gland cells, and they're shown in different colors to indicate that they produce different hormones. And you can see that the nerve inputs to this area, the anterior pituitary, are colored differently to, again, indicate that they release different chemicals. And these chemicals released by the neurons don't go directly to the anterior pituitary cells. They're dumped into the arterial supply, shown in red, that is supplying the anterior pituitary. And these chemicals act to trigger the release of the hormones that are made in the anterior pituitary. And these hormones are called releasing factors, and they were only discovered in the last 10 or 15 years. Now, this slide summarizes the overall consequences of stress, and the action begins through the nervous system on the hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus, of course, receives input from other areas in the brain, from hormones that are circulating through the brain, and also from inflammatory chemicals. And the hypothalamus then, by way of these releasing factors in the anterior pituitary, release a stress hormone called ACTH. And ACTH is an abbreviation for adrenocorticotropic hormone. And what it does is act on the adrenal cortex to release the stress hormone called cortisol. Now, at the same time you are being stressed, the brain also activates adrenaline, but it does that directly through nerve fibers that course down through the spinal cord and terminate in the adrenal medulla, the central part of the adrenal gland, and that releases adrenaline. So you have two stress hormones, cortisol and adrenaline. In the case of adrenaline, you have what perhaps you've already been taught in school, the fight or flight response. And the adrenaline triggers things like making you more alert, making your muscles tense up, increasing blood sugar, and of course it also increases heart rate and blood pressure and breathing rate. And the whole constellation of these effects is to sort of mobilize the body into action for fighting or fleeing stressful situations. In the case of cortisol, you have different responses. As I mentioned, the first thing that happens is the release of those releasing factors, and then that eventually leads to release of ACTH, which in turn triggers increased release of cortisol. Cortisol itself raises blood sugar and raises blood pressure. It decreases inflammatory chemicals, which is a good thing, and it increases your immune function, especially mobilizing white blood cells. And this too is useful to help combat the stress. The problem is when stress is chronic. When stress persists, what happens is that your system gets exhausted and you can't release cortisol anymore, and therefore you don't get the protective benefits of cortisol. And the consequence of that is, of course, ACTH is not being released anymore, and inflammatory chemicals go up in level, and the immune function goes down. And one other thing about cortisol that needs to be mentioned is that the hormone itself shrivels nerve terminals. Now think about that, because it's the communication between neurons that mediate our ability to think and perform well in school, and of course chronic stress, constantly bathing the neurons in cortisol will shrivel terminals and impair brain function.